Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into some incredible true stories, from medieval peasants surviving brutal winters, to lost ancient cities, and revolutions that changed the world. If you enjoy deep dives into history's hidden moments, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. I'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Let's see how far this community reaches. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let's begin. The unforgiving cold. Winter for the medieval peasant was not a season of festive cheer but a prolonged siege by nature. As the last autumn leaves fell, a deep, existential dread settled over the countryside. The world didn't just get colder, it transformed into a crystalline enemy. Inside the peasant's hut, a modest construction of wattle and daub, sticks, mud, and dung, the temperature offered only a polite concession to the outdoors. If it was freezing outside, it was merely less freezing inside. There were no thermostats, no insulated walls, only thin barriers against a wind that howled like a vengeful spirit seeking entry through every crack. Darkness came early and stayed late, swallowing the short days. The sole source of light and warmth was the hearth fire, a sputtering, smoky ally in the center of the one-room home. Its glow was a fragile kingdom, a few feet of flickering hope against an ocean of cold. To step outside its direct reach was to enter a different climate. Clothing provided little solace. The average peasant owned a scratchy woolen tunic, perhaps a cloak that carried the permanent scent of livestock and earth, and leggings that sagged with wear. The concept of a winter wardrobe was a luxury of the nobility. Peasants survived by layering every scrap of cloth they owned, transforming themselves into lumpy, itching human onions. The cold was an active, predatory force. Frostbite and hypothermia were not abstract concepts but nightly threats. Especially for the very young and the very old. Each sunrise where breath still fogged the air was a small victory, a minor miracle worth celebrating with a breakfast of hard bread and perhaps a less frozen turnip. If modern homes feel drafty, the medieval peasant dwelling was an enthusiastic collaborator with the wind. Constructed from locally sourced materials, woven sticks, clay, straw, and yes, animal dung for its binding and insulating properties. These walls were less barriers and more suggestions. The thatched roof, picturesque from a distance, sagged under snow and leaked rain, occasionally admitting wildlife alongside the weather. Squirrels and birds were uninvited, chilly guests. Windows were tiny holes, covered with greased animal hides or wooden shutters that rattled incessantly. Glass was a fantasy reserved for cathedrals and castles. Floors were packed earth, which in wet conditions became a muddy indoor bog. In winter, the cold seeped up from this frozen ground, a relentless, rising chill that attacked from below. Yet, within these confines, ingenuity flourished. Peasants became experts in damage control. Gaps were stuffed with moss, rags, and straw. Extra layers of mud and dung were smeared onto exterior walls as an annual winter ritual, a desperate, cold-handed attempt to fortify their fragile fortress. The home was a constant project, a battle fought with handfuls of mud and stubborn hope. The hearth was the undeniable hero, the pulsating center of peasant life. It was not a picturesque fireplace but a simple fire pit, its smoke curling upward to linger in the room before lazily finding its way out through a hole in the roof. This constant, smoky haze seasoned everything, food, clothing, lungs, but it also served as a primitive fumigant against pests. The fire's roles were manifold: cooker, light bringer, entertainer, and savior. Families huddled around its embers after sunset, sharing stories, mending tools, and simply staring into the flames because there was nothing else to do. Letting the fire die was an act of profound failure, as rekindling it without matches or lighters was a laborious, sometimes desperate task involving flint, steel, dry tinder, and prayer. Thus, the art of banking the fire was passed down like sacred knowledge. Before sleep, hot embers were carefully buried under a thick blanket of ash, insulating them through the long night. A successful banker would wake to find a few living coals, ready to be nursed back into flame with fresh fuel. It was a nightly gamble with survival as the stakes. When the hearth's warmth faded, the peasants turned to their most reliable heat source, each other. Personal space was a summer luxury. In winter, entire families, parents, children, grandparents, sometimes even visiting relatives, piled into the warmest corner of the hut in a desperate, snoring, human lasagna. Strategic placement was key. The youngest, oldest, and frailest were tucked into the center, the warmest zone. The hardier adults formed the outer layers, acting as human shields against drafts. Beds were often communal straw-filled sacks on the floor or a single large mattress that flattened under the weight of multiple generations. It was not fragrant or comfortable, but it was biologically effective. This enforced closeness forged bonds, with long nights filled with whispered stories and shared warmth. The cold was a tyrannical enemy, but it made community a tangible, skin-to-skin necessity. The livestock roommates the family wasn't the only source of warmth. Livestock were vital winter housemates. Cows, goats, sheep, chickens, and pigs were brought inside, their body heat contributing precious degrees to the indoor temperature and protecting the animals from theft or predators. The house became a chaotic, living barn. The sounds of chewing cud, clucking, and snorting mixed with human conversation. The smell was legendary, a potent blend of dung, wet wool, animal breath, and wood smoke that modern sensibilities would find unbearable. Yet, peasants developed a pragmatic tolerance. The alternative, a frozen cow or a dead chicken, meant economic ruin and less food. The hazards were real. Stepping in something unpleasant barefoot at midnight was a common peril, but the calculus was simple: warmth trumped comfort. A slightly slobbery cow's breath on your neck was a small price to pay for surviving till dawn. In a counterintuitive twist, cleanliness was not a virtue in the medieval winter, it was a liability. Peasants discovered that layers of dirt, grease, and natural oils built up on unwashed clothing and skin created a crude but effective insulating barrier. This holy filth clogged the gaps in coarse woolens, making them more wind-resistant. Bathing was rare, often associated with illness, as it was thought to open the pores to cold air. Laundry was a monumental chore involving breaking ice on frozen streams, with the high risk of garments freezing solid. Thus, clothing was worn continuously, with new layers added on top of old. By midwinter, a peasant's tunic was a historical record of spills, labor, and survival, a grimy, crusty, but thermally efficient second skin. In a world where everyone smelled of smoke, sweat, and earth, this strategic filth was not a social failing but a shared survival tactic. The concept of a comfortable bed was medieval fantasy. Peasant beds were wooden frames or simple sacks stuffed with straw, hay, or dried rushes. They were lumpy, pokey, and hosted a thriving ecosystem of fleas and lice. Over time, the stuffing compacted, grew damp, and molded, but it provided a crucial insulating layer between the sleeper and the frozen earth floor. The floor itself was a relentless foe. The cold radiated from the packed dirt, making the lowest level of the hut the coldest. Some spread thick layers of rushes or straw, which helped until it decomposed into a damp, smelly mat. If an item was dropped at night, it might as well be part of the permafrost until morning. Sleep was less about rest and more about a desperate, half-conscious effort to preserve core body heat, often involving awkward contortions to keep blood flowing. Waking up with all one's toes still attached was the marker of a successful night. To ensure the hearth's embers survived the night, many families adopted the practice of sleeping in shifts. While half the household slept, the other half remained on fire watch, tasked with tending the coals, patching drafts, and guarding their fragile warmth against the encroaching cold. This was not a formal system but a necessary, exhausting rotation. Children old enough to hold a stick took their turn. The person on watch fought heavy eyelids and stiffness, poking the fire back to life, trying not to disturb the sleeping pile of family and livestock. It was a lonely, cold vigil, but it meant the difference between a quick revival of flames at dawn and a desperate, frozen struggle to create spark. This shared responsibility underscored that survival was a collective, around-the-clock effort. Even the act of breathing became a calculated defense. Taking deep, open-mouthed gulps of frigid air was dangerous, risking lung infections that could be fatal. Peasants learned to breathe slowly and shallowly, through the nose, allowing the air to warm slightly before it reached their lungs. Some would sleep with a corner of their cloak or a rag over their mouth, creating a crude, damp breath warmer. Children were scolded for panting or playing too hard indoors in winter. It was a grim, silent discipline, a form of survival yoga where every controlled breath was a defiance of the cold's attempt to invade from within. Calories were fuel, and a heavy meal before bed was a deliberate survival tactic. Digesting food generates body heat, so peasants ate hearty, starchy dinners, thick stews of root vegetables, dense porridges, and coarse rye bread. Fatty foods were prized for their slow-burning energy. This was not gourmet dining, it was metabolic engineering. A stomach full of turnip and barley stew acted like an internal furnace, burning through the night. Parents insisted children finish their meals, no matter how unappealing. The goal was to go to bed feeling full, even bloated, because that uncomfortable fullness meant the body would work to digest it, producing precious warmth. Vivid, food-fueled dreams were a small side effect in the battle against hypothermia. Technology, peasants devised simple, brilliant tools. The hay box, a wooden crate lined thickly with straw, acted as a medieval slow cooker, keeping cooked food warm for hours without fire. But the true star was the heated stone. A flat stone would be left in the hearth fire until it glowed hot, then carefully fished out with sticks. Wrapped in rags or tucked into a clay pot, it became a bed warmer. Placed at the foot of the straw mattress or held close, its radiant heat could last for hours. The risks were real. An improperly wrapped stone could cause burns or start a fire, but when managed correctly, it was a tiny, portable sun, a profound comfort in the deep freeze of the night. Proximity to the hearth dictated social and survival hierarchy within the home. The most vulnerable, infants, the frail elderly, the sick, were given the prime spots closest to the fire. Parents and sturdy adults slept further out, acting as a buffer. It was a delicate balance. Too close and you risked sparks catching on bedding, too far and you entered the cold zone. The fire's heat was a narrow cone, creating a stark divide between the roasted and the frozen within the same small room. Animals, too, jockeyed for position, with dogs and chickens edging as close as they dared. This nightly arrangement was a silent testament to community care, where protecting the weakest was paramount to the family's overall resilience. The village as a living organism. Survival extended beyond the individual household. The medieval village operated as a single organism in winter. Neighbors kept watch on each other's chimneys. If smoke stopped rising from a hut, it was an alarm. Someone would check, often bringing an ember from their own fire to rekindle their neighbors. Food and resources were shared in dire times. Communal stores of grain and salted meat could be opened during famines. This was not pure altruism but enlightened self-interest. A dead neighbor today could mean no one to help you tomorrow. Children ran messages, the elderly kept watch. Old feuds were often suspended when the cold became lethal. This network of mutual aid was the social fabric that held the community together when the physical world was trying to tear it apart. When human ingenuity reached its limits, peasants turned to divine intervention. Faith was a practical tool. Prayers for warmth, for the fire to last, for protection against coughs, were uttered nightly. Saints were invoked as specialists. Saint Blaise against throat ailments, Saint Nicholas for household protection. Superstitions provided a sense of control. Sprinkling holy water near the hearth, marking doorways with blessed chalk, keeping a vigil candle burning, these rituals were psychological armor against the randomness of death by cold. Promises were made to God in exchange for survival. This deep, intertwined faith was not separate from daily life. It was the framework through which the terrifying uncertainty of winter was filtered and managed. For all their resilience, failure was common and brutal. Winters could be catastrophic, like the Great Famine of 1315–17, when endless rain and cold led to crop failure, starvation, and societal collapse. Letting the fire die could indeed mean a family would not wake up, found frozen in a final embrace come spring. Houses collapsed under snow. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and ears. Pneumonia and bronchitis spread in the cramped, smoky huts. Death was a familiar winter visitor, accepted with a. The medieval village operated as a single organism in winter. Neighbors kept watch on each other's chimneys. If smoke stopped rising from a hut, it was an alarm. Someone would check, often bringing an ember from their own fire to rekindle their neighbors. Food and resources were shared in dire times. Communal stores of grain and salted meat could be opened during famines. This was not pure altruism but enlightened self-interest. A dead neighbor today could mean no one to help you tomorrow. Children ran messages, the elderly kept watch. Old feuds were often suspended when the cold became lethal. This network of mutual aid was the social fabric that held the community together when the physical world was trying to tear it apart. When human ingenuity reached its limits, peasants turned to divine intervention. Faith was a practical tool. Prayers for warmth, for the fire to last, for protection against coughs, were uttered nightly. Saints were invoked as specialists. Saint Blaise against throat ailments, Saint Nicholas for household protection. Superstitions provided a sense of control. Sprinkling holy water near the hearth, marking doorways with blessed chalk, keeping a vigil candle burning, these rituals were psychological armor against the randomness of death by cold. Promises were made to God in exchange for survival. This deep, intertwined faith was not separate from daily life. It was the framework through which the terrifying uncertainty of winter was filtered and managed. For all their resilience, failure was common and brutal. Winters could be catastrophic, like the Great Famine of 1315–17, when endless rain and cold led to crop failure, starvation, and societal collapse. Letting the fire die could indeed mean a family would not wake up, found frozen in a final embrace come spring. Houses collapsed under snow. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and ears. Pneumonia and bronchitis spread in the cramped, smoky huts. Death was a familiar winter visitor, accepted with a grim fatalism. The survival of some was always shadowed by the loss of others. These tragedies were the dark counterpoint to the tales of ingenuity, a reminder that their struggle was against a foe that often won. The medieval peasant's winter was a relentless test of endurance, creativity, and communal spirit. They built a culture of resilience from straw, mud, and stubbornness. Their legacy is not one of grand monuments but of countless small, silent victories over the elements. Every modern comfort, a warm house, insulated clothing, a reliable heating system, stands on the foundation of their hard-won knowledge. They proved that human community is the most powerful furnace, that ingenuity can flourish in austerity, and that the will to survive can forge miracles from the simplest materials. Their story, etched in cold and courage, reminds us that our deepest strength is often forged in the longest, darkest nights. A star in foreign courts. And Boleyn did not enter the world destined for a crown. Born around 1501 to Thomas Boleyn, ambitious diplomat, and Lady Elizabeth Howard, she was a child of the aspiring gentry, not royalty. Her early years were spent at Hever Castle, but her true education began overseas. Sent to the glittering Habsburg court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands as a teenage maid of honor, and absorbed lessons far beyond embroidery. She learned diplomacy, languages, and the subtle art of navigating power among Europe's elite. Her transformation was completed in France, at the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and the intellectual salon of Marguerite de Navarre. Here, and mastered the art of conversation, wit, fashion, and flirtation. She learned to command a room not with beauty alone, for contemporaries noted her dark complexion and slender frame were not the era's ideal. But with an arresting presence, sharp intellect, and a style that fused French elegance with magnetic confidence. By the time she returned to England around 1522, she was a polished, formidable player, a comet ready to streak across the Tudor sky. The English court of King Henry VIII was a world of pale roses, modest, demure ladies vying for favor. Anne's return was a thunderclap. With her dark, expressive eyes, fashionable French gowns, and a wit that could flatter or flay, she drew attention instantly. She took her place as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the dignified, pious, and increasingly neglected wife of the king. And did not seek to blend in. She danced with grace, debated with men, and carried herself with a self-possession that was both intriguing and unsettling. She quickly attracted suitors, including the poet Thomas Wyatt, and her reputation as a woman of formidable charm and equally formidable resolve grew. She was not a woman to be easily possessed, a fact that would soon captivate the most dangerous suitor of all. Henry VIII, now in his mid-30s, was a king of immense appetites, for sport, for power, and for women. He was used to conquests. His eye fell upon Anne Boleyn, and he began a predictable pursuit, expecting a swift surrender. He was met with a shocking refusal. Anne would not become his mistress, as her sister Mary had been. The letters that survive from Henry II reveal a man increasingly unhinged by desire and frustration. He pleads, he promises, he rages. Anne played a masterful, perilous game. She withdrew from court, she returned, she offered friendship but denied her body. She presented Henry with a radical, tantalizing ultimatum: the only path to her was marriage. For a king married for over 20 years to a princess of Spain, this was an impossible demand. Yet, Anne's refusal made her the ultimate prize. In her, Henry saw not just a lover, but a companion of intellect and spirit, and the possibility of the male heir Queen Catherine had failed to provide. His infatuation curdled into an all-consuming obsession that would redefine a nation. Section 4, The Great Matter, Unraveling a Kingdom. Henry's desire to marry Anne Boleyn became enmeshed with his own dynastic anxieties and ego. He convinced himself his marriage to Catherine was cursed, invalid because she had first been married to his brother Arthur. He sought an annulment from the Pope, launching the tortuous process known as the King's Great Matter. For 6 years, from 1527 to 1533, England's political and religious life was consumed by this single goal. Anne was both the prize and the lightning rod. She stayed close to Henry, a constant reminder and motivator, but wisely kept a semi-public distance, allowing him to fight the bureaucratic and theological war. She supplied him with Protestant-leaning texts, challenging the Pope's authority. The court splintered into factions. The Aragonese, loyal to Catherine and the Old Faith, and the rising Boleyn faction, hungry for new power. Catherine, steadfast and defiant, became a symbol of wronged virtue, beloved by the people. And was vilified as the goggle-eyed whore, the scheming seductress tearing apart the realm. The diplomatic fallout was immense, straining relations with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine's powerful nephew. Henry's once steady world was fracturing, and at the center of the quake stood Anne, holding her nerve. Section 5, The Coronation of a Scandal. After years of legal maneuvering, Henry made his decisive break. With the Pope still refusing the annulment, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church in England. In January 1533, in a secret ceremony, he married a pregnant Anne Boleyn. Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, formally annulled the marriage to Catherine. By June, Anne was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey with unparalleled splendor. The ceremony was lavish, but the atmosphere was thin and cold. The London crowds were largely silent, some openly hostile. There were no joyous peals of bells from every church. Anne, robed in ermine and cloth of gold, processed under a canopy held by the barons of the Cinque Ports, but she walked a gauntlet of suspicion. She was anointed with the sacred oil, a ritual that made her sovereignty divine in the eyes of the New English Church. Yet, her crown felt heavy with the weight of unresolved conflict. Her triumph was built on a revolution, and revolutions have a habit of consuming. Queen Anne's court was a reflection of herself, brilliant, reformist, and tense. She presided over a vibrant cultural circle, patronizing scholars and artists. She dressed magnificently, setting trends. She wielded significant influence, advocating for evangelical reformers and diplomatic alliances with Protestant German states. Her motto, "The most happy," proclaimed her triumph. But her position was built on sand, her ability to give Henry a son. In September 1533, she gave birth not to the longed-for prince, but to a healthy girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment was a seismic shock. Henry hid it poorly. Anne, ever resilient, focused on the child's health and promised a son next time. But the crack had appeared. Subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, the last in January 1536, a baby boy, lost. Each failure widened the crack. Henry, whose love was always conditional on utility, began to look elsewhere. His eye settled on Jane Seymour, a lady in Anne's own household, who embodied the docile, blonde, English modesty and defiantly was not. Anne's fall was not caused by miscarriage alone. Her rise had created a legion of powerful enemies. The old nobility despised the Boleyn upstarts. Religious conservatives hated her reformist influence. Supporters of the disinherited Princess Mary saw her as a witch. Even her former ally, the brilliant and ruthless Thomas Cromwell, found her a political obstacle, and opposed his policy of dissolving the monasteries for crown profit, advocating instead for the revenue to fund education and charity. She had become a problem. At the same time, her sharp tongue and fiery temper, once thrilling to Henry, now grated on him. She criticized his infidelities, meddled in politics, and failed in her primary duty. Isolated, anxious, and aware of Jane Seymour's rising star, Anne's behavior became more erratic. She alternated between desperate attempts to rekindle Henry's passion and furious recriminations. The court, sensing the wind shift, began to withdraw. The queen who had once been the center of gravity was now orbiting alone in a frozen, hostile space. Thomas Cromwell, tasked with ridding the king of an inconvenient queen, engineered a solution of breathtaking cynicism. He would not arrange a divorce that would admit the king had been wrong. Instead, he would orchestrate Anne's complete destruction. In April 1536, Cromwell began constructing a case of treason so shocking it would mandate execution. The charges: adultery with 5 men, including the courtier Henry Norris, the musician Mark Smeaton, and most horrifically, incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The charge of conspiring to kill the king was also added. The evidence was flimsy, coerced, or outright fabricated. Mark Smeaton, a commoner, was likely tortured into a confession. The others maintained their innocence. The logic was absurd. Why would a queen desperate for an heir risk everything for liaisons with courtiers? But logic was not the goal. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace and taken by barge to the Tower of London. She entered through the Traitor's Gate, the same water entrance she had passed under in splendor for her coronation preparations just 3 years before. Her initial shock gave way to a steely composure. She demanded to know why she was there and swore her innocence before God. Imprisoned in the same royal apartments where she had stayed before her coronation, her mind swung between wild hope and grim reality. She learned the other accused men, including her brother, were also imprisoned. The world had inverted with dizzying speed. One day she was presiding over the May Day joust, where Henry had publicly snubbed her. Days later, she was a prisoner awaiting trial for her life, with her own husband as her chief. The trial on May 15 was a legal grotesquerie. Presided over by a panel of peers that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and the father of her former suitor, Henry Percy, it was a foregone conclusion. Anne was charged with adultery, incest, and treason. She defended herself with eloquent dignity, pointing out the inconsistencies in the accusations. How could she have committed adultery on specific dates when she was known to be elsewhere, surrounded by her household? Her logic was impeccable, and it meant nothing. The court was there to validate the king's will, not discover truth. She was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Her brother and the 4 other accused men were also convicted, and heard the verdict with terrifying calm. She reportedly said, "I am prepared to die," but asked for time to prepare her soul. Her composure unnerved those who had come to see a hysterical witch. In her last days, Anne's faith became her anchor. She moved between despair, prayer, and a macabre humor. She joked that she would be known as La Royne Sans Test, the queen without a head, and marveled at the small neck that would soon meet the sword. She wrote a final, poignant letter to Henry, its authenticity debated, appealing to his mercy for their daughter Elizabeth and the accused men, and maintaining her innocence. Henry, meanwhile, was already planning his next marriage. He showed a final, petty cruelty by postponing the execution date, forcing Anne to prepare for death twice. He also granted one mercy: instead of the axe, a skilled swordsman from Calais would perform the beheading, promising a quicker, cleaner death. It was a small kindness, perhaps for his own conscience, not for her. Section 12, The Execution, A Little Neck. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold erected on Tower Green. Dressed in a dark grey gown over a red kirtle, a colour of martyrdom, with her hair tucked under a linen cap, she was pale but composed. Facing a small, invited crowd, she delivered a short, careful speech. She did not confess to the crimes, nor did she protest her innocence regarding the charges. Instead, she praised the king as a good and gentle prince, and asked for prayers for her soul. It was the performance of a loyal subject, protecting her daughter's future and her own eternal soul with her final words. She knelt upright, without a block. A lady-in-waiting blindfolded her. The executioner, hidden among the crowd, stepped forward. With a single, swift stroke of his heavy French sword, it was over. Her last conscious thought, witnesses said, was moving her head to help the swordsman find his mark, a final act of terrible, practical courage. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Section 13, The Immediate Aftermath, The Kingdom's Whiplash. The speed of the aftermath was chilling. Within 24 hours of Anne's death, Henry VIII became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 10 days, they were married. The court erased Anne as if she had never been. Portraits were taken down, her initials were chiseled from palace walls, her household was disbanded. The little Princess Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and bundled off to the country, a forgotten relic of a disgraced union. The 5 men, including George Boleyn, had been executed 2 days before Anne. The kingdom was left in a stunned silence. The woman for whom Henry had defied the Pope, reshaped the church, and upended the succession was gone, replaced by a narrative of a monstrous adulteress. The public, however, was not wholly convinced. Many saw the judicial murder for what it was. A popular verse circulating, "God save King Henry, with all his power / and Lord Rochford, and then Boleyn, in the Tower." Section 14, The Daughter's Legacy. Anne Boleyn's most profound victory was one she never lived to see. Her daughter, Elizabeth, survived the perilous reigns of her half-siblings Edward VI and Mary I to become Queen Elizabeth I in 1558. In Elizabeth, Anne's legacy found its glorious, vindicating expression. The new queen possessed her mother's intelligence, charisma, political acumen, and fierce will. She was her mother's daughter in spirit, though she rarely spoke of her. Elizabeth's 45-year reign, the Elizabethan age, became synonymous with the flowering of English drama, naval triumph, and national identity. The Church of England, born from Henry's desire to marry Anne, was firmly established under Elizabeth. In a profound historical irony, the daughter who was deemed a worthless girl child became one of England's greatest monarchs, and the mother, once vilified, was posthumously redeemed as the progenitor of a golden age. Section 15. Anne Boleyn in History and Memory. Anne Boleyn's story has never faded. She is the tragic queen, the femme fatale, the reformer, the victim, the schemer. Her life forces us to confront the brutal calculus of power in a world where women's influence was precarious and punishable by death. Was she an ambitious climber who played a dangerous game and lost? Or a proto-feminist figure exercising agency in a cage of patriarchy? Likely, she was both. A complex woman of her time, navigating the only tools she had, her wit, her charm, and her refusal to accept a passive fate. Her ghost haunts the English imagination because her story is Shakespearean in its arc, rise, triumph, hubris, and catastrophic fall. She demonstrates how personal desire can alter the course of history, for she was the catalyst for the English Reformation, an event that reshaped a nation's soul. In the Tower Chapel, her remains, later identified and memorialized, lie near those of her cousin, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey, a sisterhood of tragic queens. But Anne's story echoes the loudest, a warning and a fascination, the queen who gambled for a crown and paid with her head, but whose bloodline and spirit endured to define an empire. The simmering colonies. By the 1760s, the relationship between Great Britain and its 13 American colonies had evolved from one of proud kinship to a tense and resentful partnership. The colonies had grown prosperous and self-reliant over a century of relative neglect under Britain's policy of salutary neglect. A generation of Americans had known no other sovereign but the king, yet they considered themselves free Englishmen, entitled to the ancient rights guaranteed by the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. The end of the French and Indian War in 1763 changed everything. Britain, victorious but drowning in war debt, looked to its thriving colonies as a source of revenue. The British Parliament, wherein no American sat or voted, began to pass a series of taxes and regulatory acts. The Sugar Act, 1764, the Stamp Act, 1765, and the Townshend Acts, 1767, were not merely economic measures. To the colonists, they were fundamental violations of the principle of no taxation without representation. Each new law was a spark landing on the dry tinder of growing American identity. Pamphlets like James Otis's The Rights of the British Colonies asserted and proved, and Samuel Adams's fiery circulars framed resistance not as rebellion, but as a defense of British liberty itself. The philosophy of resistance. The colonial protest was underpinned by a sophisticated political philosophy. Men like John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Benjamin Franklin were steeped in Enlightenment ideals. They read Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. They argued that government was a social contract, and that when a government violated the natural rights of its people, it forfeited its legitimacy. Committees of correspondence, first formed in Boston, created a revolutionary network linking the colonies, sharing news and coordinating response. The Sons of Liberty, a secret society with chapters from Massachusetts to Georgia, moved from intellectual protest to direct action. They organized boycotts of British goods, forcing merchants to choose between profit and patriotism. They tarred and feathered tax collectors, making the enforcement of British law a physically dangerous occupation. The cry of liberty and property echoed through taverns and town squares, uniting planters, merchants, artisans, and laborers in a common cause. Of all the colonial cities, Boston, Massachusetts, became the epicenter of resistance. A bustling port with a strong tradition of Puritan dissent and town hall democracy, it was also an economic pressure cooker. The closure of the frontier after 1763 and a series of economic downturns had left many artisans and laborers struggling. The presence of British troops, sent in 1768 to enforce order, turned tension into hatred. The Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, was the tragic culmination. A confrontation between a mob and British redcoats ended with the soldiers firing into the crowd, killing 5 men, including Crispus Attucks, a mixed-race dockworker. Patriot propaganda, most famously Paul Revere's incendiary engraving, portrayed the event as a deliberate slaughter of innocent citizens. Though the soldiers were largely acquitted after a defense by John Adams, the massacre became a permanent rallying cry. It cemented in the colonial mind the image of Britain not as a mother country, but as a foreign occupier willing to use lethal force against its own subjects. Section 4, the Tea Act, a deceptive peace. After the repeal of most Townshend duties, a fragile calm descended. Then, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. On its surface, it was not a new tax but a bailout for the floundering British East India Company. The act gave the company a monopoly on tea sales in America and allowed it to sell directly through its own agents, cutting out colonial merchants. It even made the company's tea, with the Townshend duty still attached, cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. To Parliament, it seemed a masterstroke: save the company, affirm its right to tax, and give the colonists cheaper tea. To the colonists, it was a sinister trap. Accepting the cheaper tea meant acquiescing to the principle of taxation. Furthermore, it threatened to bankrupt colonial merchants and smugglers who were pillars of the resistance economy. The Tea Act united disparate groups: the intellectual patriots, the working-class sons of liberty, and the business elite, against a common threat. It was perceived not as an economic boom, but as an insult to their intelligence and a test of their resolve. Section 5, the deadline approaches. In the autumn of 1773, 7 ships laden with East India Company tea set sail for American ports: Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and Boston. The response was immediate and coordinated. Mass meetings resolved that the tea must not be landed. In Philadelphia and New York, popular pressure forced the tea consignees to resign and the ships to turn back with their cargo untouched. In Charleston, the tea was seized and stored in a warehouse, where it molded for years. Boston was different. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was a native Bostonian but a staunch loyalist. His 2 sons were among the tea consignees. Hutchinson was determined to enforce the law. When 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor in late November and early December, he refused to issue the papers that would allow them to leave without unloading. The 20-day customs deadline began to tick. The tea sat in the harbor, and the city sat on a powder keg. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be neither a peaceful protest nor a chaotic riot, but something entirely new. Section 6, the Old South Meeting House, Bay Revolution in session. For weeks, Boston was a city in continuous town meeting. The gathering place was the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Thousands crammed inside, with more spilling into the streets. Here, all of Boston society debated fate: wealthy merchants in fine wool, sailors in tarred trousers, farmers from the surrounding villages in homespun. Leadership came from the body of the people, not a formal government. Samuel Adams and John Hancock provided direction, but the votes were taken from the floor. They sent messengers to Governor Hutchinson demanding the ship's departure. He refused. They posted guards on the wharf to prevent the tea from being smuggled ashore at night. The deadline of December 16, when customs officials could legally seize the cargo, loomed. On the morning of the 16th, over 5,000 people gathered at Old South. A final appeal was sent to the governor at his country mansion in Milton. The writer returned at dusk with the answer: the tea would be landed. Section 7, Samuel Adams's signal. As twilight fell on December 16, the meeting was in uproar. Then Samuel Adams rose and announced, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." This was not a statement of defeat, but a prearranged signal. According to some accounts, it was met with war whoops and cries from the back of the church. The meeting was adjourned, and the crowd poured into the chilly, dark streets. Meanwhile, in the attic of the Boston Gazette and in Waterfront Tavern, a plan was already in motion. Dozens of men, perhaps as many as 130, had been preparing. Their target was not the ship's other valuable cargoes of china and cloth, only the tea. Their method was to be destruction, not theft. Their identity was to be disguised, but their action was to be a public statement. Section 8, the disguise of principle. The men who gathered at the wharf that night were not a lawless mob. They were a disciplined, quasi-military force. Many were artisans, apprentices, and merchants, respectable citizens. To conceal their identities from British prosecution and to lend a symbolic air to their act, they adopted a crude, mohawk disguise. They smeared their faces with soot and grease, draped themselves in blankets, and stuck feathers in their hair. The disguise was theatrical, not convincing. Its purpose was to transform them from individuals into avatars of the people, and to link their act to the concept of American savages, throwing off the yoke of European civilization. They divided into 3 teams, each boarding one of the ships at Griffin's Wharf. The operation was conducted with remarkable order. The crews were told they meant no harm to person or property, only to the tea. The hatches were broken open, and 342 chests of tea, weighing over 92,000 pounds, were hauled onto the deck. Section 9, The Sound of Revolution. For the next 3 hours, under a clear, cold sky and the light of a quarter moon and lanterns, the men set to work. They swung axes and hatchets, splitting open the wooden chests. The fragrant smell of bohea, kongu, and sochong tea filled the salty air. They shoveled and kicked the tea over the railings, where it swirled into the dark harbor water. High tide turned the water into a vast, steeping pot. So much tea was dumped that it formed damp mounds at the water's edge. Boys waded in to stuff it into their pockets, only to be chased away by the patrolling Sons of Liberty. Not a single item besides the tea was damaged or stolen. A padlock broken on a captain's trunk was replaced the next day. A silent crowd of spectators watched from the wharf. British naval vessels were anchored mere yards away, but no Marines intervened. The action was too swift, too disciplined, and too backed by the will of the entire city. By 9 p.m., it was done. The men marched back up the wharf, their hatchets and axes held high. A fife played. They faded into the maze of Boston streets, removed their disguises, and became ordinary citizens once more. Section 10, Morning After, The Harbor of Tea. Dawn on December 17th revealed the extent of the defiance. The tide had gone out, leaving a thick, soggy line of tea leaves plastered along the shoreline. The smell of tea and saltwater hung over the north end. Wharf rats, it was said, avoided the water for days. The financial loss was staggering, 9,659 pounds worth of tea, over $1. 5 million today, a direct blow to the world's most powerful corporation and the British Treasury. The reaction in Boston was a mixture of awe, pride, and anxiety. Many celebrated the bold stroke. Others, particularly among the merchant elite, feared the inevitable retribution. Governor Hutchinson was apoplectic, writing frantic dispatches to London describing the destruction as the work of a maddened populace. The patriots, however, maintained a public silence. No one was identified. The Mohawks were ghosts. In the newspapers, the event was reported with a sly neutrality, often just as a bold and memorable action. Section 11, London's Fury, the Coercive Acts. When news reached London in January 1774, the reaction was one of unified, imperial fury. King George III and Parliament saw the Boston Tea Party not as a political protest but as criminal vandalism and outright insurrection. The sovereignty of Parliament had been openly mocked. The debate was not about if to punish Boston, but how to make an example so severe that colonial resistance would be crushed forever. The result was the Coercive Acts of 1774, dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. 1. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, strangling the city's economic life. 2. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter, abolished its elected council, and gave the royal governor power over town meetings. 3. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, beyond colonial juries. 4. The Quartering Act authorized the housing of British troops in private homes. A fifth act, the Quebec Act, while not punitive, inflamed the colonies by granting religious freedom to French Catholics and extending Quebec's border into western lands claimed by several colonies. Section 12, The Martyrdom of Boston and the Rise of Unity. Britain's strategy backfired catastrophically. Instead of isolating Boston, the intolerable acts made it a martyr and united the colonies as never before. Food and supplies began flowing into Boston overland from other colonies. Committees of correspondence ignited with plans for a collective response. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in support of Boston, and was promptly dissolved by the royal governor for its insolence. The call went out for a Continental Congress. In September 1774, 56 delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia absent, gathered in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. They were a diverse group, radical firebrands like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, cautious moderates like John Dickinson, and wealthy planters like George Washington. They had no legal authority, but they represented the collective will of American resistance. Section 13, the First Continental Congress. The Congress was a revolutionary body in a conservative guise. Its initial aim was not independence but redress of grievances and restoration of their rights as Englishmen. They passed a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, petition. The King, and, most significantly, formed a Continental Association to enforce a complete boycott of British trade, imports, exports, and consumption. They also agreed that if the coercive acts were not repealed, they would reconvene in May 1775. The association created local committees in every county and town to enforce the boycott, effectively creating a shadow government that bypassed royal authority. The Congress adjourned in October 1774, having taken the irreversible step of creating a unified, intercolonial political body. The lines were now drawn. As George Washington wrote, "The crisis has arrived when we must assert our rights, or submit to every imposition that can be heaped upon us." Section 14, The Road to Lexington and Concord. The winter of 1774–75 was a Cold War. In Massachusetts, a provincial congress, operating illegally, collected arms and organized militia units, known as Minutemen. British General Thomas Gage, now the military governor of Massachusetts, fortified Boston and waited for reinforcements. The countryside was an armed camp, bristling with defiance. Gage received orders in April 1775 to seize the rebels' military stores in Concord, a village 20 miles west of Boston. He hoped for a swift, secret strike. But Boston was a city of eyes. On the night of April 18, when British grenadiers and light infantry began to row across the Charles River, signals were lit in the Old North Church steeple, "To if by sea." Paul Revere, William Dawes, and others set off on their midnight rides, rousing the countryside. By dawn on April 19, when the British advance force reached Lexington Green, they found 77 Minutemen drawn up in defiance. A shot rang out, from which side, no one knows. And the British regulars fired a volley, killing 8 Americans. The war had begun. The British marched on to Concord, destroyed some supplies, and faced a growing swarm of militia on their return march. The shot heard round the world at Lexington was followed by bloody running battle back to Boston. By day's end, nearly 300 British soldiers and about 100 colonists lay dead or wounded. The British Army was besieged in Boston. The American Revolution had moved from argument, to protest, to open warfare. Section 15, The Legacy of the Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was the pivotal nonviolent act that made violent revolution inevitable. It demonstrated that colonial resistance had moved beyond words and boycotts to targeted, symbolic destruction of property. It forced Britain to reveal its hand. It would rule by coercion, not consent. In doing so, it stripped away the last vestiges of loyalty for thousands of colonists. The Tea Party proved that the amorphous, American cause could produce disciplined, collective action. It provided a template for resistance that was both bold and morally legible. They destroyed property, but harmed no person. It transformed Samuel Adams's philosophical arguments into a tangible, unforgettable image, chests of tea floating in a moonlit harbor, the physical manifestation of a people's refusal to be bought. In the grand narrative of the revolution, the Tea Party is the point of no return. It is the moment when the dispute over taxes crystallized into a struggle over sovereignty. The tea was never just tea, it was the symbol of an unequal relationship. By dumping it, the colonists rejected not just a commodity, but the very idea that they were subjects to be managed. They declared, in the most dramatic way possible, that they were citizens who would govern themselves. A world before history's memory. 5,000 years ago, as the great stones of Stonehenge were still lying untouched in the quarries of Wales, and 1,000 years before the first pharaoh ordered a pyramid built on the sands of Egypt, a city was rising on the other side of the world. In the Soup Valley, a narrow, sun-baked strip of land between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes Mountains of what is now Peru, a people came together to achieve something extraordinary. They built not a village, not a ceremonial center, but a full-fledged city, Carroll. For nearly a millennium, it thrived in complex harmony, a cradle of civilization in the Americas, and then it was forgotten. Swallowed by desert sands and time, it vanished from human memory so completely that its rediscovery would force a rewrite of history itself. The unlikely garden, taming a desert. The Soup Valley seems, at first glance, a place chosen by mistake. A barren landscape of dust and rock, where a thin river struggles to reach the sea. It is a land of extremes, scorching sun, cold nights, and almost no rain. Yet, the people of Carroll saw not a wasteland, but a canvas of immense potential. Their first and greatest innovation was hydrological. They became masters of the desert by becoming masters of water. They engineered an intricate system of irrigation canals, tapping the Soup River to bring life to the parched earth. With these artificial veins, they transformed the valley floor into a green oasis. They cultivated a revolutionary crop, cotton. Not for clothing primarily, but for fishing nets and textiles that would become the engine of their economy. Alongside cotton, they grew beans, squash, guava, and sweet potatoes. They understood crop rotation and soil management. Their agriculture was not a struggle against nature, but a sophisticated partnership with it. They listened to the land's rhythm and amplified it, creating plenty where logic said there should be none. The pyramids of peace, architecture and astronomy. The most breathtaking evidence of Carroll's sophistication is written in stone and earth. Dominating the cityscape are 6 monumental platform mounds, the largest, Pyramide Mayor, stretching over 450 feet in length and rising to a height of 60 feet. These are not natural hills, but meticulously engineered pyramids, built with retaining walls of rounded stones and filled with millions of woven shikra bags packed with. The scale is staggering, requiring the coordinated labor of generations. But unlike the pyramids of Giza, these were not tombs for god kings. They were temples and stages for civic and ceremonial life. Their design reveals a deep, precise understanding of the cosmos. The central plaza of the city, a sunken circular amphitheater, and the alignment of the pyramids themselves are oriented to celestial events, the solstices, the rising of certain stars. The architecture was a physical calendar and a spiritual antenna, connecting the community to the cycles of the universe. Staircases led to summit platforms where rituals were performed, with sacred fires that could be seen across the valley. The city itself was a machine for living in harmony with cosmic order. A society without swords, the Carroll Enigma. Perhaps the most profound mystery of Carroll is what archaeologists have not found. After decades of excavation, there is no evidence of warfare. No weapons. No defensive walls. No mutilated bodies or mass graves suggestive of conflict. In a world where the history of early civilization is often a chronicle of conquest, Carroll stands as a startling exception. It appears to have been a peaceful theocracy, a society that flourished for centuries without internal violence or external threat. Power seems to have been vested in religious and administrative elites who coordinated the vast public works, the pyramids, the irrigation systems, the trade networks. Their authority was likely based on knowledge, of astronomy, of agriculture, of engineering, and of the spiritual rituals that guaranteed balance. Social cohesion was maintained not by force, but by shared belief, communal labor, and the tangible benefits of cooperation. The city's layout, with distinct residential sectors for different social strata and large public plazas, suggests a highly organized but not tyrannical social order. The sound of civilization, music and ritual. Life in Carroll was not silent. The scale is staggering, requiring the coordinated labor of generations. But unlike the pyramids of Giza, these were not tombs for god-kings. They were temples and stages for civic and ceremonial life. Their design reveals a deep, precise understanding of the cosmos. The central plaza of the city, a sunken circular amphitheater, and the alignment of the pyramids themselves are oriented to celestial events, the solstices, the rising of certain stars. The architecture was a physical calendar and a spiritual antenna, connecting the community to the cycles of the universe. Staircases led to summit platforms where rituals were performed, with sacred fires that could be seen across the valley. The city itself was a machine for living in harmony with cosmic order. A society without swords, the Carroll enigma. Perhaps the most profound mystery of Carroll is what archaeologists have not found. After decades of excavation, there is no evidence of warfare. No weapons. No defensive walls. No mutilated bodies or mass graves suggestive of conflict. In a world where the history of early civilization is often a chronicle of conquest, Carroll stands as a startling exception. It appears to have been a peaceful theocracy, a society that flourished for centuries without internal violence or external threat. Power seems to have been vested in religious and administrative elites who coordinated the vast public works, the pyramids, the irrigation systems, the trade networks. Their authority was likely based on knowledge, of astronomy, of agriculture, of engineering, and of the spiritual rituals that guaranteed balance. Social cohesion was maintained not by force, but by shared belief, communal labor, and the tangible benefits of cooperation. The city's layout, with distinct residential sectors for different social strata and large public plazas, suggests a highly organized but not tyrannical social order. The sound of civilization, music and ritual. Life in Carroll was not silent. Among the most evocative finds are the musical instruments. Archaeologists have uncovered flutes crafted from the bones of pelicans and condors, meticulously drilled to produce specific notes. They have found cornets of deer and llama bones, and shell trumpets. These were not toys, but instruments of ceremony. Imagine the scene at dusk in the great circular plaza. The elite positioned on the pyramid terraces, the community gathered in the sunken amphitheater below. Priests, adorned in fine cotton robes dyed with vibrant minerals, would raise shell trumpets to the darkening sky. The haunting sound would echo off the stone walls. Musicians would play bone flutes, their melodies intertwining with the rhythm of rattles. This was not mere entertainment, it was a sacred technology. Music was believed to commune with the gods, to bring rain, to ensure fertility, to maintain the cosmic balance. The very act of communal music making reinforced social bonds, vibrating through the collective body of the city. The keystone of an ancient economy, trade networks. Carroll did not exist in isolation. It was the vital heart of a widespread trading network that connected the coast, the highlands, and the jungle. Their prime commodity was cotton. Grown in the irrigated fields of the Sud, it was spun into nets of exceptional quality. These nets were traded with fishing communities along the Pacific coast, who in return supplied Carroll with vast quantities of dried anchovies and sardines, the primary source of protein for a city far from the sea. From the Andes in the east came traded goods like the vivid dyes of the cochineal insect, hallucinogenic snuff from the vilca tree, and prized obsidian for tools. From the Amazonian jungle to the north came exotic feathers and hardwoods. Carroll's merchants and diplomats must have been skilled negotiators, maintaining peaceful exchange routes across hundreds of miles of diverse and difficult terrain. This flow of goods was also a flow of ideas. technologies, and cultural influences, with Carroll acting as a sophisticated hub where the resources and knowledge of three distinct ecological zones converged. The invisible workforce, engineering and labor. Building the pyramids of Carroll was an act of social engineering as much as civil engineering. Moving the millions of tons of stone and rubble required a massive, organized workforce. Yet, there are no signs of slave quarters or evidence that labor was coerced. The prevailing theory is that construction was a communal, rotational duty, perhaps tied to religious festival cycles or organized by kin groups. The workers used simple, brilliant technology. The sheeper bag was their innovation, large, durable nets woven from reeds, filled with stones, and used as building blocks. These bags created a flexible, earthquake-resistant fill for the pyramids. Ramps of compacted earth and scaffolding of algarobo wood were used to raise materials. The coordination was precise: quarrying, transportation, basket weaving, construction, all happening in a synchronized rhythm. This collective endeavor, likely accompanied by music and ritual, would have strengthened communal identity, turning the very act of building the city into a sacrament that bound the people to the Kipu, knots of memory. One of the most tantalizing clues to Carroll's intellectual life is the presence of quipus, or quipus. These are intricate devices of knotted strings, used centuries later by the Inca as recording devices for census data, calendars, and narratives. In Carroll, archaeologists have found the earliest known examples of these string records. A Carroll quipu is a bundle of cotton cords. The main cord has a series of pendant strings hanging from it. On these strings, a series of knots are tied, their type, simple overhand, figure 8, long knot, and position conveying information. While the exact code of the Carroll quipus remains undeciphered, their existence is revolutionary. It suggests that the inhabitants had developed a sophisticated, non-written system of information storage, a three-dimensional, tactile language of knots. They were recording something: astronomical data, tribute records, genealogies, or perhaps even myths. The quipu is a testament to a bureaucratic and intellectual mind, thinking in a way utterly foreign to the alphabetic traditions of the Old World. The domestic sphere, life in the residential quarters. Spreading out from the monumental core were the neighborhoods where Carroll's people lived. Excavations reveal well-planned residential units. A typical home was a large, roomy house built of stone and cane, with walls plastered with clay. Inside were hearths for cooking, storage pits lined with stone, and spaces for sleeping and craftwork. Families were likely extended, and daily life revolved around domestic and artisanal tasks. Women ground maize on stone mortars, cooked stews of beans and fish, and wove exquisite textiles on backstrap looms. Men may have tended the cotton fields or participated in rotational labor on the public works. Children's toys, like small clay figurines, have been found. The homes show evidence of renewal, floors resurfaced, walls rebuilt, indicating generations of continuous, stable habitation. This was not a transient priestly center, but a true city where people were born, worked, worshipped, and died. The environmental pact, a delicate balance. The success of Carroll was a high-wire act of environmental management. Their entire existence depended on the Soup River, a capricious source. Prolonged drought or a catastrophic El Niño event, a massive warming of Pacific waters causing torrential rains and floods on the coast, could destroy their irrigation systems and wipe out their crops in a single season. There is evidence they were acutely aware of this fragility. Their ritual life was almost certainly geared towards appeasing the forces of nature. Offerings found in the foundations of pyramids included precious shells, crystals, and even human figurines, suggest acts of propitiation. Their astronomical observations were not abstract. Knowing the solstice meant knowing when to plant and when to harvest. They lived with a constant, intimate awareness of their ecosystem, and their science and religion were a single, integrated system for sustaining the balance. For centuries, the balance held. The slow fade, why Carroll was abandoned. Carroll did not fall in fire or war. It appears to have been gradually, peacefully, abandoned over perhaps a century or more. The most compelling theory points to climate change. Geological and archaeological data indicate that around 1800 BCE, the region entered a prolonged period of severe drought. The Soup River may have dwindled to a trickle or shifted its course. The irrigation canals ran dry. The cotton withered, the trade networks based on it collapsed. Faced with a slow-motion environmental crisis, the social contract may have frayed. The priests' rituals failed to bring rain. The administrative elite could no longer coordinate abundance. Families and kin groups likely made the difficult decision to leave, migrating to more reliable valleys along the coast or further inland. They took their knowledge, their Kipu records, and their gods with them. The pyramids were left empty, not desecrated. The wind began its long work of burying the plazas with sand. The most astonishing fact is that the memory of the place seems to have vanished even from the descendants of its builders. It became a city of ghosts, its name lost. The sand secret, millennia of oblivion. For nearly 4,000 years, Carol slept. The massive mounds, overgrown with hardy desert shrubs, were assumed by the few who saw them to be natural formations, huacas, sacred places, of unknown origin. The local farmers of the Soup Valley, tilling their fields at the feet of these giant hills, had no idea they were cultivating the outskirts of a metropolis. Treasure hunters occasionally dug into the mounds, finding only broken pottery and shells, unaware of the urban fabric beneath. The colonial Spanish chroniclers, obsessed with Inca gold, rode past without a second glance. Even the early 20th century archaeologists, like the great Julio C. Teo, the father of Peruvian archaeology, who worked nearby, did not recognize Carol's true age or significance. The city was protected by its own obscurity and the sheer scale of time that had rendered it part of the landscape itself. It waited, holding its breath, for an eye that could see. The archaeologist who listened, Ruth Shady's revelation. The rediscovery of Carol is inextricably linked to one woman, Dr. Ruth Shady Solis, a Peruvian archaeologist of formidable determination. In the mid-1990s, intrigued by the large mound complexes in the Soup Valley, she began a systematic survey. Unlike others, she suspected these were not isolated temples but part of a much larger, integrated settlement. Her first excavations in 1996 revealed something shocking. The architecture was monumental and complex, but the pottery fragments were simple, even crude, compared to later Peruvian cultures. According to traditional archaeology, monumental architecture came after the development of advanced ceramics. Carol seemed to invert this logic. She dared to hypothesize the unthinkable. That this could be a pre-ceramic city, vastly older than anyone imagined. To prove it, she sent organic material, reed bags, wood, textile fragments, for radiocarbon dating. The results returned dates centering around 2600 BCE. The academic world was stunned. Carol was contemporary with the pyramids of Egypt and the great cities of Mesopotamia, but it was in Peru, a civilization born in complete isolation from the old world. Unearthing a new origin story. Shady's work, ongoing for over 25 years, has meticulously peeled back the desert to reveal Carol's full glory. Each season uncovers new wonders, a ceremonial fire altar, where burnt offerings sealed political agreements, a sunken temple with a central obelisk, residential complexes for the elite featuring private courtyards and ventilation ducts. The picture that emerges is of a fully formed, sophisticated urban society. The impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. Before Carol, the narrative of civilization's dawn was a story of the Old World, the Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River. The Americas were seen as latecomers. Carol shattered that paradigm. It proved that the human impulse to build cities, to organize complex societies, to study the stars, and to create monumental art arose independently, multiple times across the globe. The Americas now had their own pristine cradle of civilization, as ancient as any in Egypt or Iraq. The living legacy, Carol's children. Carol did not die without issue. While the city itself was abandoned, the cultural template it created. The pyramid building, the sunken circular plazas, the reliance on irrigation, the use of heat roofs, echoed down the centuries. These elements became foundational to what archaeologists call the Andean cultural tradition. They appear, refined and expanded, in the later great cultures of Peru, the Chavín, the Moche, the Nazca, and ultimately, the Inca Empire. The Inca Sun Temple at Cusco, the Coricancha, with its gold-clad walls and precise astronomical alignments, is a direct ideological descendant of the pyramid platforms of Carol. The decentralized, reciprocal labor system the Inca used to build their empire, may have roots in the communal work parties of the Suc Valley. Carol was not a dead end, but a source. The first seed from which a magnificent cultural tree would grow, branching out over 3 millennia to create one of the world's most impressive imperial civilizations. Whispers from the sand, what Carol tells us today. Walking through Carol today is an experience that transcends archaeology. The wind whispers through the ruins. And the scale of the silence is as profound as the scale of the pyramids. This place forces a re-evaluation of human potential. It tells us that civilization is not a single invention, but a latent possibility in the human spirit, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Carol's most powerful lesson may be its peace. In a 21st century gripped by conflict, the image of a complex, thriving society that managed its affairs for centuries without warfare is a haunting and hopeful vision. It suggests that cooperation and collective belief can be as powerful as coercion and conquest. It challenges the Hobbesian notion that early human life was necessarily nasty, brutish, and short. At Carol, it was communal, ingenious, and enduring. Finally, Carol is a monument to memory and forgetting. It reminds us how vast the stretches of human history are that lie outside written records, and how fragile our own constructions may be. Its silent stones ask us a question. What of our own cities, our own achievements, will survive the next 5,000 years? And what stories, lost to us now, are waiting beneath the sand for a future eye that knows how to see? The city of Carol endures, no longer forgotten, a beacon from the very dawn of our shared human journey, proving that great beginnings can happen in the quietest of places, beneath the shadow of the great pyramids, the true essence of Carol pulsed in its daily rhythms. This was not merely a ceremonial complex but a living, breathing city of perhaps 3,000 souls. Their existence wove together the mundane and the sacred, creating a social fabric of remarkable resilience. Each dawn, the city awoke not to the sounds of carts on cobblestones, but to the stirring of reed mats, the crackle of hearth fires being revived, and the distant murmur of the Suc River, the lifeline upon which their world was built. The rhythm of daily existence. For the majority of Carol's inhabitants, life was anchored in agricultural cycle. Men and women would trek to the irrigated fields outside the city's core, tending to the prized cotton plants, weeding rows of beans, or checking the water channels for clogs. The work was communal and rhythmic, synchronized with the sun's passage. In the afternoon, the focus shifted to domestic and artisanal tasks. Women gathered in shaded courtyards to spin cotton into fine yarn using drop spindles, their fingers moving with practiced speed. The click-clack of backstrap looms created a soft percussive soundtrack as intricate textiles took shape, fabrics that would be used for clothing, for trade, or for sacred offerings. Men might work stone, chipping obsidian, or local basalt into tools and decorative items. Others were involved in the perpetual maintenance of the city itself, repairing a section of an irrigation canal, mixing clay plaster for a house wall, or contributing their rotational labor to the pyramid projects. Children played underfoot, mimicking adult tasks with small clay figurines or toy hebrews made of string, learning the codes of their society through play. Food and feast, the culinary landscape. The Carol diet was a testament to their successful trade networks. Meals were built around staples like dried anchovies and sardines, reconstituted in stews with beans, squash, and chili peppers. Guava and poke fruit provided sweetness. Feasting was a crucial social and political glue. On ceremonial occasions, large-scale food preparation took place in communal kitchens near the pyramids. Evidence shows massive hearths and deposits of food waste containing shellfish, mollusks, and the bones of guinea pigs and small deer. These feasts were not mere celebrations but instruments of social integration. By sharing food procured through the elite-controlled trade networks, the leadership reinforced bonds, rewarded labor, and displayed. The stories we have walked through are not isolated chambers in a museum of the past. They are interconnected chambers in a single, vast mansion of human experience, lit by the same fundamental flames of struggle, ingenuity, ambition, and survival. From the frozen huts of medieval peasants to the silent pyramids of Cairo, from the executioner's block at the tower to the tea-strewn waters of Boston Harbor, from the clatter of the first loom to the lonely caravans on the Silk Road and the terrifying first contact on Caribbean shores, each narrative is a different colored thread on a single, immense loom. The weave they create is the tapestry of us. The unbroken thread of resilience. Consider the medieval peasant, banking a fire with ashes as a blizzard howled, and the Inca descendant of Caro's people, rebuilding terraces after an El Niño flood. Separated by millennia and continents, they are kin in their intimate, daily negotiation with a hostile environment. Their resilience was not the heroism of epics, but the quiet, stubborn heroism of the next breath, the next planted seed, the next patched wall. This thread, the will to persist, to outlast the winter, the drought, the famine, is the most fundamental in our tapestry. It is the background upon which all other patterns are drawn. Our modern world, with its central heating and global food supply chains, has insulated but not severed this thread. Our resilience is now tested against pandemics, cyber collapse, and climate change, different storms, but the same essential act of huddling together and deciding to endure. The dual threads of ambition and power. Follow the dark, glittering thread of ambition from Boleyn's chambers to Thomas Cromwell's study, to the counting houses of East India Company directors, to the laboratories of James Watt and the boardrooms of Carnegie and Rockefeller. This is the drive to ascend, to control, to reshape the world to one's will. It builds pyramids, courts, empires, and industries. It is a creative and a destructive force. Anne's ambition helped break a church and crown a queen, but it led her to the scaffold. Industrial ambition built cities of miraculous productivity atop mountains of human suffering. This thread is perpetually intertwined with its counterpart, the thread of collective power and resistance. The Luddites smashing frames, the Chartists demanding a voice, the Sons of Liberty disguised as Mohawks, the villagers of Carroll contributing their labor to a communal pyramid, these are not opposites to ambition, but its necessary counterweight. They are the loom's tension, the force that prevents the ambitious thread from pulling the entire tapestry into a frayed, autocratic knot. History is the perpetual, often violent, weaving of these two threads. The concentration of power and the struggle to check, share, or overthrow it. The delicate thread of peace. Carroll stands in our tapestry as a rare, luminous patch of a different color. Its apparent centuries of peace, without fortifications or weapons, challenges the assumed pattern that complexity requires conflict. It whispers an alternative, that cooperation, shared belief, and a common project can be the glue of civilization. This thread is delicate, often drowned by the darker hues of war and conquest, but it is never entirely absent. It is in the Pax Mandalica that briefly secured the Silk Road, in the mutual dependencies of the caravanserai, in the international scientific collaborations born of the age of exploration. It is the thread we must now, desperately, learn to strengthen and follow, for the stakes of conflict have grown from swords to nuclear codes. The tangled, poisoned thread of exchange. The Columbian exchange embodies the tragic duality of connection. One thread carried potatoes and tomatoes, fueling population growth and culinary revolution. Another, twisted inseparably around it, carried smallpox and the chains of slavery. The Silk Road carried Buddhist sutras and astronomical charts along the same routes as the bubonic plague. The Industrial Revolution exchanged unprecedented material comfort for urban squalor and climatic disaster. This is the tapestry's most sobering lesson: human exchange is never pure. It is always a package deal of wonder and suffering, innovation and exploitation. Our modern internet, the Silk Road of data, carries knowledge and connection with one hand, and disinformation, addiction, and surveillance with the other. We have not transcended this ancient, tangled knot. The thread of memory and forgetting. Why was Carol forgotten while the pyramids of Giza never were? Why do we remember Anne Boleyn's name but not the names of the millions who died in the great dying of the Americas? Our tapestry is full of holes, places where threads have been pulled out by time, conquest, or catastrophe. Memory is not a passive record, it is an active, political act of preservation and erasure. The winners spin the threads of history into glorious patterns, the losers often vanish into the tapestry's unseen backside. Rediscovering Carol, re-evaluating Anne Boleyn not as a seductress but as a political actor, acknowledging the foundational role of enslaved labor in the Industrial Revolution, these are acts of reweaving, of trying to restore the full, complex picture by picking up lost threads. The unfinished loom, weaving now. The loom is still clattering. We are not observers of this tapestry, we are the weavers sitting at it now. The challenges we face are ancient ones dressed in new fabrics. Our climate crisis is the medieval peasant's winter on a planetary scale, a test of collective resilience and ingenuity. Our battles over democracy and autocracy are the old struggles of the chartists and the courtiers, fought with algorithms and media instead of pamphlets and pikes. Our globalized economy is the Silk Road and the Triangle Trade, exponentially accelerating, forcing us to confront the same old dilemmas of inequality and ethical exchange. Our search for meaning in a digital, fast-paced world echoes the romantic poets' revolt against the machine, and the carol priests' need to align life with cosmic harmony. The threads we choose to pick up and the patterns we choose to weave today will be the history that future generations study. Will we weave with the thread of Carol's cooperation, or of Cortez's conquest? With the thread of the fire banker's stubborn care, or of the unchecked industrialist's rapacious consumption? A final glimpse at the pattern. Look back at the tapestry from a distance. See the peasant's hearth fire, a tiny, brave point of orange. See it echoed in the ritual fires atop Carol's pyramids, in the lanterns of the Boston Tea Party, in the furnaces of Coalbrookdale. It is the human spark, of warmth, of ceremony, of defiance, of creation. See the networks. The footpaths between medieval villages, the trade routes of the Soup Valley, the caravan trails of Central Asia, the shipping lanes of the Atlantic, the fiber optic cables on the ocean floor. We have always been connectors. The story of humanity is not a linear march from darkness to light. It is a cyclical, recursive, beautiful, and terrible weaving. We advance in technology and retreat in empathy. We build towers of breathtaking cooperation and then burn them in paroxysms of greed or fear. We are the freezing family sharing body heat, the queen gambling for a crown, the merchant risking the desert for spice, the worker staring at the factory clock, the native watching a strange sail appear on the horizon. We are all of them. Their blood is in our veins, their choices haunt our institutions, their hopes and failures are the templates for our own. The tapestry is vast, and our life is but the brief moment we are given to touch the shuttle, to guide a single thread. Let it be a thread of awareness. Let it be a thread that remembers the whole, flawed, magnificent pattern. And let it be a thread that, in its small way, chooses to mend, to connect, and to add not to the chaos, but to the enduring, stubborn, beautiful design of human survival, dignity, and grace. The loom never stops. Weave well. The end.